Welcome. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've joined us today on Halloween and that you're giving us 1 hour of your time today. Don't worry if you do need to go away from your screen to answer the doorbell for trick-or-treaters. This program is being recorded, so you can catch whatever you missed on our YouTube channel. Our foundation celebrates a hero, Aristides de Souza Mendez. And every Sunday for the last year and a half, we've been profiling many, many heroes of rescue and resistance. Today, we have the beautiful story of Jesse Owens. What an inspirational figure. And you're going to learn much more about him today. I do certainly hope that you had a chance to see the film. And now we have a chance to hear more and to have your questions answered. So right now I'm going to turn the floor over to my dear friend and colleague, Robert Jacobitz, who's going to be the moderator for today's program, and he's going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Olivia. It's again an honor to be a part of the program and to be associated with the Souza Mendez Foundation. We have three really wonderful presenters, and I'm pleased to introduce, in the order they'll be presenting, Anita DeFrantz, a former vice president of the International Olympic Committee, and has held various offices in the IOC, and as an athlete represented the United States in the Olympics in rowing competition. In addition to being an Olympian, I can best describe Anita as a civil rights activist, working for equal opportunity for athletes of color and for gender equality as well, and she holds a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Lori Weintrob is professor of history and founding director of the Wagner College Holocaust Center, Staten Island, New York. In addition to sharing with us material from the Wagner College Holocaust Center, she will also share the proud and unique relationship Wagner College has with Jesse Owens. Stuart Owen Rankin is the proud grandson of Olympian legend Jesse Owens. He is the incoming executive director of the Jesse Owens Foundation, taking over that role from his mother, Marlene Owens Rankin. He is a successful athlete in his own right and will share with us some very poignant stories of his grandfather's life experiences and his own relationship with him. So I'm pleased that we have our esteemed panel. And Anita, would you please begin with your presentation?
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. As an IOC member, I want to take this chronologically. The International Olympic Committee selected Berlin over Barcelona in 1931. That was 2 years before Hitler was known of. So understand the IOC always selects the city in advance so that the city has the opportunity to prepare. In 1933, the IOC members started to get very worried about how the games would be conducted. And indeed, the US IOC member insisted that he needed to be confident that Jews on their team would be treated fairly, as he said, in order to have the strongest team at the games. In 1934, that was the year that the US, the American Olympic Committee, decided to compete at Berlin after many, many discussions and a famous meeting at the New York Athletic Club. So that was their decision. In 1935, a message was sent from the president of the Maccabiah World Union to also demand that athletes would be, Jewish athletes in particular, would be treated fairly. And the response from the president then of the International Olympic Committee was that absolutely they would be treated equally. At the 1936 Olympic Games, there were among the team were two African-American women. They could have qualified to the 1932 Games, but they were not. selected for that team. They both traveled on the ship together with all the other athletes, as everyone else did. And unfortunately, when one of the two was a hurdler, in the first round of hurdles, she hit one and broke her foot, which unfortunately led to the other African-American woman, Louise Stokes, being sent home. She never had the chance to compete, which was just terrible. We know the story of Mr. Owens at the Olympic Games and his friendship with the German athlete. Some historians have said that wasn't true, it was all photos, but you saw in the video after Owens had completed his long jump, Lutz went over and embraced him. That was not set up. That was true friendships. After the games, Mr. Owens was asked by the Amateur Athletic Union to stay in Europe to compete at other events because they could make money off that. Mr. Owens declined, saying he needed to get home and support his family. The Amateur Athletic Union decided, well, that's enough of him, and banned him from any other athletic competitions. Mr. Owens and the other African-American members of the American Olympic team was denied the opportunity to visit the White House by President Roosevelt, who was standing for re-election and was concerned that that might not be good for his re-election. So unfortunately, the US continued its discriminatory practice. And I can assure you, as the movie showed, that in the Olympic, I'll call it bubble, since that's what we called it in Tokyo, there is a world that should be as our world should be. And I often say, if we could do this for 4 weeks, 2 weeks before the games, we should be able to do this forever.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita. Dr. Weintrob.
Thank you. I would like to thank my fellow panelists and the Sousa Mendes Foundation for this opportunity to discuss Jesse Owens and the moment in August of 1936 when a global audience of 300 million tuned in on their radios to hear the Olympic Games in Berlin. Athletes from 49 countries around the world performed for Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, and other Nazi officials. When Germans won, the audience screamed out, Deutschland, Deutschland, and the Horst Wessel song, the Nazi party anthem, was sung. At this early stage of the Nazi regime, it was important to build both international and domestic popular support. After 3 years of brutal treatment of political opponents, Jews and Roma, and the opening of the Dachau concentration camp, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, saw the Olympics as an unparalleled opportunity to present, quote, the new Germany. For 17 days, the 5 Olympic rings, a symbol of international cooperation and peace, flew alongside the Nazi swastika, a symbol of hate and Aryan superiority. As we grapple in our own times to address the stubborn persistence of racism and anti-Semitism, Jesse Owens' talent challenged white supremacist ideology, and his passion expressed the triumph of human dignity. I argue we need to highlight his values and his life in Holocaust and history courses to understand how the Nazi power grew, to challenge prejudice in all its forms, and to untangle shared Black, Jewish, and interracial alliances. At the 1934 Youth Day rally in Nuremberg, Hitler was explicit about his vision of the German body. Quote, in our eyes, the ideal German boy should be quick as a greyhound and hard as Krupp steel. Hitler appointed a staunch Nazi and SA leader as head of the Reichssports office. This new Reichssportsführer announced, quote, every German athlete should voluntarily participate in strengthening the military might of the German people. The Nazis connected physical strength to Germany's military goals, and sports became a source of Aryan pride. The Reichssports office wasted no time to enact an Aryan-only policy in all German athletic organizations. The German Boxing Federation excluded Jews, such as Erich Seelig, seen here on a magazine cover, who was forced to immigrate to the United States. Germany's best high jumper, Gretel Bergmann, received a letter in the spring of 1933, quote, "You are no longer welcome here because you're Jewish, Heil Hitler." She and other Jewish athletes were banned from tracks, pools, courts, and training facilities. As Anita mentioned, the banning of non-Aryans from Germany's Olympic team was condemned internationally as a violation of the Olympic Code of Equality and Fair Play. In the US, Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, former Olympian and president of the Amateur Athletic Union, and Fiorello LaGuardia, New York City mayor, galvanized Catholic, Jewish, and labor leaders to support a boycott. Significantly, the NAACP condemned Nazi anti-Semitism and pressed the IOC in 1933 to transfer the games to another country, a proposal supported by the Associated Negro Press. Jesse Owens declared, quote, "If there are minorities in Germany who are being discriminated against, the United States should withdraw from the 1936 Olympics." However, his coach at Ohio State pressured 20-year-old Jesse Owens to switch and adopt a pro-Olympic position. Take a moment to consider what this meant. After all the work and racism that Jesse had faced since junior high school, this exchange reveals a great deal about his character. It means a lot to me and is part of why his story is an integral part of the Wagner College Holocaust Center permanent exhibit. In the face of concerns about restrictions by reason of class, creed, or race, the Nazis offered Avery Brundage, president of the American Olympic Committee, a highly managed tour in the summer of 1934, which included interviews with Jewish athletes, but always in the presence of Nazi officials. At its conclusion, Brundage affirmed that Jewish athletes in Germany were being treated fairly, and the AOC voted unanimously to participate in the Olympics. However, as the boycott movement continued in the summer of 35, Brundage argued the pro-boycott Jews were putting their own, quote, clan ahead of a patriotic enterprise. He alleged a Jewish communist conspiracy to keep the US out of the game and that American athletes should not be involved in the, quote, Jew-Nazi altercation. The Nuremberg laws, notably the law on German blood and honor, were issued in fall of 1935, which some noticed were modeled on the anti-miscegenation laws in 18 American states. Charles Sherrill of the IOC, who met twice with Hitler to insist that one Jew be allowed on the German team, stated it bluntly, quote, "As to obstacles placed in the way of Jewish athletes, I would have no more business discussing that in Germany than if the Germans attempted to discuss the Negro situation in the American South or the treatment of the Japanese in California." The US ambassador to Germany, William Dodd, tried to persuade President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull to take leadership steps to boycott the games. But in December of 1935, the Amateur Athletic Union voted narrowly to participate in the Berlin Olympics. And so, on August 1st of 1936, Hitler opened the 11th Olympiad, as you saw in the film, with a new ritual, the lighting of the Olympic torch carried from Greece to Berlin by 3,000 runners. This first Olympic torch was made by Krupp, the German steel company that produced weapons for the Nazis in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, and it took place only months after the remilitarization of the Rhineland. As the games began, Goebbels deceitfully declared, quote, "We desire in these weeks to prove to the world that it is simply a lie that Germans have systematically persecuted the Jews." Nazi officials suspended anti-homosexuality laws, removed anti-Jewish signs, and relocated 600 Roma or Gypsies in Berlin to a nearby suburb. It was a false image of a peaceful and tolerant Germany. Not only did German sports teams give the Nazi salute on magazine covers, so too did many visiting Olympic team members. And there was a dominant presence of the military, as in the pregame show at the Olympic swimming trials, where German soldiers dove into the pool in full military field equipment. The over 1,500 journalists who covered the Olympic spectacle emphasized the millions of swastika banners, a swirl of, quote, naval and military display. The reason for all the pomp and ceremony, they wrote, is that the Berlin Games, unlike all others, are an expression of a state, a showpiece for the glorification of the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler. Some wondered if it contradicted Rule 50 of the IOC Charter, which stated, quote, "No kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites." Nonetheless, on the ground and in the field, Nazi racist ideology was challenged, particularly by the 18 African-American athletes who won 14 Olympic medals. Although only a small percent of the 334 athletes on the American team, they had voyaged to Berlin on an integrated ocean liner, the Manhattan, a first for many of them. As Owens wrote in his memoir, in 3 years of college at Ohio State, he had never eaten with the white athletes. Quote, "We were good enough to compete with the white athletes, but not good enough to shower with them afterwards or to ride with them to the meets." John Woodruff, who won the 800-meter run and would serve in the US military, later exclaimed with pride, "It was very definitely a special feeling in winning the gold medal and being a Black man. We destroyed Hitler's master race theory whenever we start winning those gold medals." Other successful Black athletes included Mac Robinson, the older brother of Jackie Robinson, who won silver in the 200-meter race, and Ralph Metcalf, a future congressman, also raced successfully. The 2 Black women on the team did not bring home medals, but they were the first Black women to represent the US in the Olympics. The star of the Olympic Games was Jesse Owens. This lean youth, the Buckeye Bullet with a lightning form, earned 4 gold medals and broke the world's record in the 200-meter race and in the long jump. The feet of Owens, who grew up in rural Alabama, the grandson of a slave, were captured in Leni Riefenstahl's film Olympia, alongside the, quote, Aryan supermen. Owens later credited his success in the long jump to advice from Lutz Long, his German competitor. Their friendship across lines of race was a highlight of the Games, to be discussed today by Jesse Owens' grandson, Stuart Rankin. In addition, there were American Jewish athletes at the Olympics, notably Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, seen here aboard the ship Manhattan on their way to Berlin, practicing for the 100-meter relay team. They were pulled at the last minute, which Stoller particularly attributed to anti-Semitism and appeasement of Hitler. Owens protested, again showing his character. He protested his replacement of Glickman, but was overruled. In all, there were 9 Jewish athletes in the Olympics, 6 of whom were from Hungary, including Endra Kabos, who earned 2 gold medals. There were 4 additional athletes of Jewish descent. Helene Mayer, whose father was Jewish, earned a silver medal in fencing. She was the single Jew Hitler had promised the IOC. When Owens returned to New York, he enjoyed a ticker tape parade, yet had to use the freight elevator to enter the reception at the Waldorf Astoria. The criticism of Hitler in African-American newspapers for his refusal to shake hands with Black athletes was part of a larger campaign, the Double Victory Campaign, that became a rallying cry for Black Americans to secure both victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Interestingly, by 1942, the Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, showed that over 80% of its African-American readers believed that Jews in Germany were more persecuted than Blacks in the United States. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary of Jesse Owens' victory, quote, "White humanity should be ashamed." Yet Goebbels quickly added his expectation that after the Olympics' happy conclusion, Germany could get ruthless. Most significantly and embarrassingly, the New York Times reported that the Games put Germany, quote, "back into the fold of nations and even made the Germans more human again." But the Olympics did not make the German government more human, but rather than less so. Having secured a major victory in terms of propaganda and public support internationally and domestically, the Nazis accelerated their persecution of Jews and Blacks and militarism. In 1937, brought the forced sterilization of Afro-Germans, the so-called Rhineland bastards or mixed-race children, several hundred born to German women and French colonial soldiers. The degenerate music exhibit of 1938 was one example of the way Nazi persecution of Jews and Blacks was linked. And the Nazis made true on their promise, when the Olympics are through, we'll batter the Jew, on November 9th and 10th, 1938, with the unleashing of Kristallnacht and the killing of 91 Jews, an anniversary we are soon to commemorate. During World War II, the Nazis targeted Black POWs with particular cruelty. Among the many European Jewish athletes killed by the Nazis, Roman Cantor, one of Poland's leading fencers who competed in the Berlin Olympics, was deported to Majdanek and murdered in 1943. Burnt Black corpses were also discovered in Majdanek. The reputation of Avery Brundage in recent years has been in sharp decline. Brundage's successful delivery of the Olympic team to Berlin paved the way for his election to the IOC, over which he would reign as president for 20 years, between 1952 and 1972. Since the 60s, there were accusations that Brundage was anti-Semitic, sexist, and racist, and recently his bust was removed from an Asian art museum in San Francisco. In contrast, Jesse Owens' reputation continues to grow and should grow even more. In 1955, he was named Ambassador of Sports by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He later served on the board of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And in 1976, he earned the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Gerald Ford for his service to humanity. My personal connection to Jesse Owens relates to that same year when Black History Week becomes Black History Month. The president of Wagner College, where I teach, offered an honorary doctorate to, quote, America's greatest track and field star of the century, businessman and humanitarian. He said, Wagner honors you for your unshakable belief in the equality of man, for your high ideals and personal example to our nation, for your timely message on our campus. Owens is shown here with the student president of Black Concern in an article by a Wagner College student that offers Jesse Owens as a role model in the fight against both anti-Semitism and racism. To conclude, the African-American poet Langston Hughes put the lessons of the 1936 Olympics and Jesse Owens poetically in his 1943 verses. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. In the face of the evidence of violence of Nazism and fascism, the world applauded a regime that persecuted Jews and Blacks. Yet the alliance of Black and Jewish organizations of the 1930s and the values and role model of Jesse Owens is something we can still learn from today to fight systemic racism and anti-Semitism. We must study these lessons so that history does not repeat itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weintrob. Stuart?
Thank you, Robert. Good day, everybody. It's great to be here. It's a real honor and a privilege. I'm happy to be with you. I want to thank fellow panelists for taking the time and spending part of your Halloween, your Sunday with us and sharing your experience and expertise. I'm here because I wanted to share with you my experience with a man that we're talking a lot about, my grandfather, Jesse Owens. And I wanted to just share share some personal tales with you, give you some insight to who he was and what he was like as a family man, as an everyday human being. And that's quite honestly what he was to me. He was granddad. And as you can see here in this picture, I have to laugh every time I see it. This is me on my grandfather's knee, sitting next to him and my grandmother. I have to say that if there is ever a great woman behind a great man, it is certainly my grandmother, Ruth, technically Minnie Ruth Owens. She was a fantastic woman. But my grandfather to the family was granddad. And many people often ask, well, what stories did he tell you about the Olympics? Did he tell you what it was like to, really burn Hitler? And honestly, my grandfather never talked directly to me and my cousins about the Olympic Games. He truly led his life as a, I'll say, normal grandfather. And I put that in air quotes because I knew, even at that young age in that picture there, I knew that my grandfather had received some notoriety and that he was known around the world as having at one time been the fastest man in the world, which actually leads me to a story that I'll share with you. Probably a year or two before that picture that we just saw, again, I knew Granddad as Granddad, but I did know that he was at one time the fastest man in the world. I was with him going back to his house, which was in an apartment building in Chicago. That photograph was taken in Chicago on my parents' back stoop. So we had a sliding door that opened out to our patio, and that's where that picture was taken. But my grandfather lived in an apartment building a few blocks away. And in that apartment building was a very, very long hall from the elevator to my grandparents' door. And one day, like I said, maybe 1 or 2 years before that picture was taken, I decided to challenge my grandfather's fastest man abilities. And I was a pretty fast kid growing up. I fancied myself pretty athletic and fancied myself as being pretty fast. So I challenged my grandfather to a foot race from the elevator to his front door, feeling quite confident that I was going to beat him because of his advanced age. Well, he showed me no mercy and he beat me to the front door. And I was so upset. Again, I was, a kid. I was maybe 6 years old, and I was so upset not to have beaten the fastest man in the world. And I proclaimed that he can't always win. It's just not fair. He can't always win. And of course, I shattered my grandfather's heart by doing that. But that is one of the stories that I often share and remember from my childhood. As I mentioned, my grandfather lived in Chicago at that time, but he then moved to Phoenix, Arizona. My grandfather was susceptible to respiratory issues and often got pneumonia during Chicago winters. And so the doctors prescribed an arid, warm environment for him. And so he and my grandmother moved from Chicago to Phoenix, Arizona in 1972. But they would spend, as you would imagine, their summers back in Chicago because the summers in Phoenix can get so uncomfortable. So they would spend their summers and their holidays back with the family in Chicago. He was definitely a family man. He was the patriarch of the family. He enjoyed laughing. He enjoyed playing golf. He enjoyed having his buddies over, playing cards. So I knew Ralph Metcalf. I knew Dave Albritton. They were all known as Mr. Metcalf, Mr. Albritton, of course. And so it was nice to see my grandfather as a human being. And it's always nice and heartening to see what my grandfather's accomplishments in 1936 have continued to mean to people even in this day and age, so long ago. So it's always very, very heartening and touching for us family members to see this and to participate in events like this. I mentioned that I'm one of 5 grandchildren. My grandfather and my grandmother had 3 daughters. My mother was the youngest of my grandfather's daughters. So there was nobody to carry on the Owens name. Each of my mother's 2 older sisters also had daughters. So there was really no chance of the Owens name going anywhere. So as you may have seen in that last picture, my middle name is Owen, not Owens. I came along as the 5th grandchild and the only boy from my grandfather's family tree up until my generation. So my middle name is Owen. My mother didn't think that the name Stuart Owens Rankin flowed quite as nicely. So she took the S off and thought that Stuart Owen Rankin flowed much more comfortably, but it is an obvious homage to my grandfather and my grandmother. There's another story I want to share with you, and it relates to this slide. Mention was made briefly of my grandfather's friendship, unlikely friendship, with German athlete Lutz Long. And there's some question of its authenticity. I can assure you that it was a true friendship. And for me, candidly, one of the single most significant displays of sportsmanship that I've ever known of. Lutz Long was competing against my grandfather in the long jump. And if you saw the More Than Gold video prior to today's talk, you'll know that my grandfather was at risk of DQing or disqualifying before making the final heat of the long jump. And it was actually Lutz Long's advice that helped my grandfather clear his last jump in the semis to make it to the final heat. And Lutz Long just said, with your jumping ability, why don't you just put your practice towel next to the runway, or just jump about a foot in advance of the jumping board, and you'll still make the distance to make it into the finals. And so my grandfather took that advice, made it to the finals, defeated Lutz Long. Lutz Long got the silver. My grandfather got the gold. But immediately after my grandfather's gold winning jump, as you saw in the film, Lutz Long was there to greet him and to welcome him and to congratulate him. And so they did forge a very unlikely friendship based on competition and sportsmanship, which I think they both held very, very dearly as athletes. Of course, this was all in the face of Hitler. Sadly, Lutz Long did die in the war on the front lines in Italy. And I can't say with any kind of certainty if that was, some sort of retribution for his display of sportsmanship and affection towards my grandfather, but it certainly is a coincidence. Now, what's interesting about this story is that I've always, like I said, have always held the Lutz Long story in high esteem in my life. I was traveling for business in 2012 in Munich, and I was talking to some German colleagues, and uncharacteristically, it came up, and I mentioned to my colleagues that I happened to be the grandson of Jesse Owens. I won't go into all of the details as to how or why it came up, but I shared with them that I was the grandson of Jesse Owens, which is something that I don't do very typically. And this one colleague of mine turned and looked at me in awe, like, you're kidding. And I'll be honest, I was kind of used to that response, but what I wasn't clear about was the fact that she was giving that response to me for a very specific reason. She immediately reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone, which I thought, okay, this is strange. Where is this going? And she started scrolling through her contacts list, and she got to the name Julia Kellner Long, which is a friend of hers who happens to be the only grandchild of Lutz Long. And so she turned to me and she said, do you know who Lutz Long is? I was like, of course I know who Lutz Long is. That man and that competitor and fellow athlete is, means a lot to me and my family. She's like, well, this is his granddaughter. You have to meet her. And so the next time I was in Munich for business, my colleague, got me together with Julia, and that's the picture of me and Julia having dinner one night in 2012, just coincidentally. And so I like to think, yes, Cookie, definitely goosebumps. I still get goosebumps when I tell that story, and I still get teary-eyed. I have to think that both Lutz and my grandfather appreciate that reconnection of our families, and we're still friends. Julia and I are still friends. This slide is pretty funny to me because, as I mentioned earlier, I knew my grandfather ran fast, and I knew that he traveled quite a bit for a normal grandfather, and I knew that he had some major accomplishments in the Olympics. But it wasn't until he appeared in this commercial for American Express that I really felt, oh, okay, he is famous. So it was his appearance in the American Express commercial, the old "Don't Leave Home Without It" campaign, that really impressed me, and is when I realized, oh yeah, my grandfather really is a famous person, because I remember seeing that on TV and thinking that was pretty cool. So I just wanted to share with everybody a little bit of the human and family side of my grandfather. And again, I want to thank the panelists, and I certainly want to thank the Susan Mendez Foundation for inviting me to participate and for spotlighting my grandfather. It's greatly appreciated.
That's great. Thank you, Stuart. And thank you both, Lori and Anita. You gave wonderful presentations. Olivia now is going to give us an update of upcoming activities, programs for the foundation. So Olivia, please share with our guests what we have coming up.
Fantastic. I certainly will. So a couple of things I need to mention before we get there. First of all, please do put your questions into the chat box. Robert will be taking them out of the chat box and moderating the Q&A. So while I'm talking about upcoming programs, please write your questions in. The other thing I wanted to be sure to mention was that ship that the athletes were on, called the Manhattan, is actually connected to the Sousa Mendes story. Why? Because in June of 1940, that ship went from Lisbon, Portugal to New York carrying visa recipients on board. So that's just a lovely connection between the story we're presenting today and the story we present every day at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So coming up next Sunday, we have a delightful film about Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. It's a film called My Herzl, and it's truly a lovely film. You'll really enjoy it. That is a paid program, but feel free to pay whatever's comfortable for you. We do suggest the ticket price of $18, representing Chai in Hebrew, or life. But if you can give more, please do. And if that's not comfortable for you, give whatever is comfortable. When we do have paid programs, they pay for our free programs, such as today's program, of the rest of the month. And of course, your contributions are tax deductible. So that is next week, My Herzl. In 2 weeks' time, we bring you a French film with English subtitles called in English, The Legacy of Aristides. And that's a brand new film about our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. You'll hear the trailer in a minute, but let me just take you to the end of our season. So after that, in the rest of November, we have 2 Italian programs back to back. We have a story of Jewish Italians in Italy, and that's a program called Our Hebrews, about a Tuscan mountain village that rescued its Jewish population during World War II. And then the following week, we have a program about Jewish Italians in the United States called Fleeing Mussolini, Italian Jewish Refugees in the United States. And that program explains how these Italian immigrants were not like most of the Italian immigrants because they were Jewish, and they were also not like the American Jewish community because they weren't Ashkenazi, they didn't speak Yiddish, and didn't quite fit in. So it's a very interesting story that you'll want to hear. And then our final program of this fall season will be on December 5th. And there we will be highlighting a modern day hero named Judy Feld-Carr, who single-handedly over a 28-year period rescued the Jews of Syria. And she was able to take out by bribery or smuggling and other means over 3,200 human beings, saving their lives. So I'm so excited that we're going to be honoring her on December 5th. So definitely put that on your schedule. Right now, we're going to look at the trailer for the film that is coming up in 2 weeks, The Legacy of Aristides.
Ma mère, pendant 50 ans, elle nous racontait toujours cette histoire, qu'elle n'avait rien compris. On lui avait dit qu'il fallait attendre des jours devant le consulat. Et elle, au contraire, elle avait été accueillie par le consul. Il avait tamponné les 17 passeports sans les regarder.
C'était le seul sujet qui pouvait faire pleurer mon père. L'histoire de comment il avait été sauvé en tant qu'enfant juif à l'âge de 7 ans et demi.
Le fait que j'ai 2 fils, 4 petits-enfants, tout ça n'aurait pas existé, c'était pas Sousa Mendes.
Je crois que Aristides a été un juste, un héros, et c'est ça qui reste et c'est ça qui compte.
Great, so I do hope you will tune in for our programs to come. Today after the program, you'll get an email with information about how to sign up. And if you recognized the second voice in that trailer speaking in French, that was actually me. So you'll get to learn more about my own family history and the work of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So now, Robert, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. And we do have a number of inquiries, questions. One of the more important ones that came up at the very beginning was there any apology to Jesse Owens when he was pulled from the Olympics that anybody knows of?
I'm not aware of any formal apology from the AAU. I would defer to Anita if Anita knows, not to put you on the spot, Anita, but I'm not familiar with one.
I looked to see if there had been one, and I think the answer is no.
No, part of the discussion, the dialogue and discussion is a response from a gentleman who said that Owens was berated in the locker room for what he wanted to do, and ostensibly it was understood to be on the behest of Avery Brundage. Does anybody know what really happened in those locker rooms after he was so gracious? Go ahead, Lori.
I can add just a little bit. I believe the exact words were, "You will do what you are told to do." The whole tone of that being quite paternalistic and final, not something you would argue back against. I think there was some, attempt to explain it as a form of favoritism based on who the coaches were that were saying this. I think it's not absolutely certain it goes back to Brundage, but certainly it could. In general, both Brundage and the head of the IOC at the time, have a very complicated relationship to the desire on the one hand to protect the notion of fair play and therefore not to see Jewish athletes abused, persecuted by the Nazis and completely excluded, but that also, like perhaps Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, and even FDR, there's a kind of acquiescence to anti-Semitism. And in the case of Brundage, there seems to be both an anti-communism, which was not that uncommon in that time period of the 30s, but also based on what he says, there definitely seems to be some anti-Semitism. So I don't know to what extent that has been reckoned with in the IOC, but certainly among historians and the general public, it does seem like it has become somewhat of a conversation.
Yeah, well, Anita, you have been an officer of the IOC, and you surely know the history of what was there as an elitist organization, both anti-Black and anti-Jewish. Tell me, how was that experience getting yourself, quote unquote, integrated into the IOC?
Yes, the first of all, I was the fifth woman elected in a group of about 100 IOC members, so that was a bit challenging as well. But I took them at the word that the Olympic movement is working to make the world better through sport, and insisted on that, and insisted that more women be included if we're going to do this. That is, after all, half of the world's population. And we are a worldwide organization, so the question about me being African American wasn't really an issue there, because the rest of the world people have lots of different skin tones. So it's interesting that actually my being a woman was more challenging than my skin color.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Stuart, unmute yourself because I have a question for you. And it seems that you have a number of fans in the audience. And one inquiry is they wanted to know, what sport did you excel in, Stuart?
Well, believe it or not, it was not track. To my grandparents and my parents' credit, there was never any pressure on any of the grandchildren to try to follow in my grandfather's footsteps, literally and figuratively. So the sports that I tended to play were common American sports that most young boys play with their buddies. I grew up playing football, both recreationally and organized football. I swam in high school, and I played tennis in high school. And when I went to college, I attended the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. I fell in love with a sport called lacrosse. I had never seen it and immediately took to it. So believe it or not, I started playing lacrosse in college and played through my collegiate and even post-collegiate career.
And in your advanced years, you're still active in sports, right?
Well, in my advanced years, I've turned down the level of competition. I still recreationally play basketball. I enjoy nice long walks with my wife and our dog. Those qualify now as sports. I also do swim and rollerblade when I get the chance.
Good for you. Good for you. Hope you use pads when you rollerblade. But in any case, okay, good.
Any
good.
protective gear they make, I wear.
Great. You know, the last slide was of your grandfather holding the American Express card. With all of the glory of being a world-renowned athlete, he had to go back to segregated America. Did he ever share any of that disappointment, or how did it affect his life?
That's a fair and good question. But my response is similar to the one that I often give when people ask if he talked about his time during the Olympics. The answer is no, he didn't really talk to us, certainly as grandchildren, explicitly about how hard it was for him, particularly earlier on upon his return from the games. My grandfather was always a very proud and principled man. I think even indirectly, what he taught to us, his grandchildren and his daughters, was that whatever you do, just do your best at it, whatever it is, and good things will come. And so my grandfather just persevered. He just continued to be who he was and to live life the only way he knew how, and that is to sort of give it his all. And fortunately, as the tide in society started to evolve and mature and get better, things began to get better for my grandfather. So again, you know, if you saw the More Than Gold video, you saw him appear on the What's Your Line game show. He appeared in an episode of This Is Your Life. And as Lori mentioned, you know, in 1955, President Eisenhower named him Special Ambassador of Sports. And so he started to appreciate, or I should say, the fruits of his labor started to sort of come later in his life.
Thanks, Stuart. Lori, I have a couple of questions for you. One is, you did mention it, essentially the rationale of why Roosevelt never met with Jesse Owens. And again, you know, he was a complicated man, Roosevelt. The Jews, as we know, during the war adored Roosevelt for the most part, and yet he had this double standard. Can we call it that?
Well, there's been a few books about Roosevelt and his Jewish policy, his policy about Jewish refugees, that it seems very in sync with how he's reacting here to the Olympics and to the Black athletes and Jesse Owens. So you know, at first it was a situation where we made the press made a big deal about Hitler snubbing Jesse Owens and the Black athletes, and then it turns out there's a bigger story where he congratulated the German athletes on the first day. And then he was told, if you're going to shake hands with anyone, you have to shake hands with everyone. So he decided he wouldn't shake hands with anybody. So he didn't specifically snub the Black athletes, but all the athletes, although it seems to me that it really is, it comes down to almost the same thing. But I think for Jesse Owens, and Stuart, you can correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, but I think it was more painful to him that Roosevelt was the one who snubbed him, and that he didn't get invited to the White House, and he, wasn't invited to the White House until the time of Gerald Ford. So I think that, the racism that he experienced here, and actually I think it's worthy of like a whole nother program, because, what he experienced at Ohio State, growing up in Alabama, the extent to which he had to work to support himself. I mean, from what I read, that he had to wake up early to practice his sport where everyone else was practicing after school. He had to go and work and make a living. And then when he was in college, he got no scholarships. I mean, his life was very difficult. And so I think that's what makes it so even more astonishing when he says that he would even consider not going to the Olympics because of anti-Semitism. So then when he is so successful and still doesn't get that recognition from his own country, especially since in the moment in Germany, the German public was so warm to him. Everybody wanted his signature. Everybody cheered for him. There was a kind of acceptance by the German people that felt so very, very different. Oh, he got to stay with the white athletes in Germany in the same hotel. There wasn't the same kind of segregation. The racism in Germany existed. It was pretty bad against the Black soldiers in the Rhineland, who had the same stereotypes as in the American South. But in the moment of the Olympics, there was this warmth towards the 18 African-American athletes that was really very different than what happened once they got home. And also in general, what happened to Black World War II veterans when they got home.
Yeah, we know those stories.
Yeah, so I don't know if that answered the question.
It did. I could ask many more questions. There's lots of questions, but we're running out of time. And I apologize for that. Yes, Lori.
I wanted to pick up on one of the questions in the chat and ask Stuart his opinion on this, about whether Jesse Owens' story is taught in schools, and is it taught enough is my question. I mean, I know I saw exercises in penmanship where they talked about just his victories in the Olympics, but do you think it's taught enough?
I don't know how to answer whether or not it's enough, but I will say that I am surprised that to this day there are schools that do focus on my grandfather and his story and his achievements in the 36 games. Just last year, my family received the most adorable and sweet note from an elementary school in Alabama. Now, naturally, that was where my grandfather was born, so there's a little bit of likelihood that he's going to be a subject of focus. But it was from an elementary school that was doing a special segment on my grandfather, and it's not only from states like Alabama, but I've received notes and sweet letters from elementary schools all around the country. So it's not a formal part of any curriculum, but the story, again, as I was saying earlier, to this day, it still holds up. It's still as significant as it was then. And it just amazes us and honors us and heartens us every time we see evidence of it.
That's great. Thank you, Stuart.
I know there's not much time left, but I want to say that I had the privilege of meeting your grandfather, Stuart, at a time when I was struggling to get the team to Moscow, and he encouraged me to keep up the fight for the athletes. I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Anita, while you're there, for our last moments of comments, why don't you lead off? We have 2 minutes left for each one. So Anita, why don't you, then Lori, then Stuart. Go ahead, Anita.
Thank you. Back to the IOC now. We truly believe that the Olympic Games can make a difference. Often it doesn't look like it should be there, and the next year we'll have the Olympic Games in Beijing, but it is magical that at the time of the Games, the Olympic Village and indeed the Olympic Dining Hall does look like the entire world. And you can sit anywhere and talk to anyone. And it is something that creates ambassadors for a better world. We make mistakes, but the Olympic Games are truly about the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We keep growing, right, Anita? We keep growing. Thank you. Lori?
Yeah, I think we need to do more programs like this as part of both Holocaust education and anti-racist education. I personally believe that there's still so much more to dig into the story, and that it has a potential to appeal to a broad cross-section of students, of young people of all faiths and races. Owens helped to persuade many Americans to extend the promises of liberty and equality to African Americans. He drew attention to discrimination in sports and in the nation, and to the promise of democracy and to its fragility, lessons that remain relevant today. To quote him from the New York Times obituary, Owens once said, "Any Black who strives to achieve in this country should think in terms of not only himself, but how he can reach down and grab another Black child and pull him to the top of the mountain where he is. That is what a gold medal does to you." And so to me, the kind of character that he represents, the character values, as well as his ability to represent the forces against the escalation of the Holocaust, and understanding how the Nazi power grew while the world stood silent or applauded Hitler. I just think there's still a lot to unpack here, both specifically for Holocaust education and also more generally for human rights and the struggle against racism and anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Lori. And just as you just mentioned it, what are the hours of the Holocaust Center at Wagner College?
Oh, that's a great question.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, first, you can just email holocaust.center@wagner.edu. That's the best way to reach us. And you can also Google our website to see all the events that we have coming up. We have a big event coming up for Kristallnacht. Our center is actually, the physical center is opening for International Holocaust Day in January. So we do have a physical space, but we also just have a lot of programming and outreach into the local schools. And we do a lot with theater. And in June of 2022, we're having a very big international conference, Heroines of the Holocaust, New Frameworks of Resistance. So I invite everybody in person or on Zoom to come to New York for that in June of.
Great, great. Thank you. So we're all invited, right? Okay, good. And Stuart, tell us.
I just wanted to say thank you, Robert, and to everybody, especially to the Susan Mendez Foundation. It's been a true pleasure and honor to take part in today's conversation. I want to thank everybody for their questions and their words of support. If there's anything that I would highlight, there is a park, a Jesse Owens Memorial Park in Alabama, Oakville, Alabama, where my grandfather was born. He did migrate to the north, to Ohio, and then eventually to Chicago. But his birthplace is Oakville, Alabama, and the residents of Oakville are very proud of my grandfather and his roots in their soil. And they, through years and years of volunteerism, have erected a beautiful park and museum in my grandfather's name. And so I would encourage anybody and everybody on the call to take a look at the Jesse Owens Memorial Park. If you have the opportunity to visit it in Alabama in person, please do. I'll drop the link to the park in the chat. I know that the park, like I said, has been run primarily by volunteers, and I know that, like most things, the COVID years have been very tough for them. But we support them and encourage people to endorse and participate in the park and museum as much as they can. And again, thank you for the spotlight on my grandfather and his accomplishments.
Thank you, Stuart. You know, before this program, Jesse Owens was just a name to me. It's been a growing experience for me also. And I thank all of you. And I hand it off back to my esteemed colleague, Olivia, for closing comments.
Great. Well, yet again, an hour has just flown by. And so thank you all, and join us again next week and in the weeks to come. Have a happy Halloween, everybody. Bye-bye.